Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
In this episode, Cameron and I do a deep dive into where we can have certainty and where we can't. We reference fundamentalism, political motivations, theological motivations, and why we have a desire to have certainty in some categories but not others. We talk about what reasonable certainty is. And this basically is just a good reminder of how knowledge works, about how certainty works, about reference points for orthodoxy in our lives, and some reflections on the history of fundamentalism and where those historical markers pop up again in our modern time. If you appreciate what we're doing, we hope that you like, share, subscribe. You can visit toltogether.com and support the work that we do and find out more information about what we're up to in the world. Thanks so much.
I was really struck by something that you said in one of our previous episodes, Nathan. When we were talking about, it was actually the episode where we talked about Alex O'Connor, the new kind of skeptic. And you had said that there is our posture before the unknown is very important. And I think the response there was Alex O'Connor had basically asked John Lennox a question that had to do with people who are very certain of their views. In this case, Christians who are very certain of their views. As is his custom, O'Connor was careful with his wording. He didn't use the word fundamentalist, but that's probably what he had in mind, and that's really the direction John Lennox went in a very gracious way. And it brought me, so this is an issue that crops up in times of great kind of cultural upheaval, and it makes perfect sense. When things seem very uncertain, what do we crave? We crave
Ice cream.
certainty.
Oh, certainty.
Well, and you always crave ice cream, so that is just an absolutely perennial thing.
It was a joke. Certainty is the right answer.
You crave certainty. And even if it comes at the cost of truth sometimes or the complexity of life. And so one specific example that I want to begin with, and this is really more of a springboard, involves my old professor, Mike Licona, who is he's a resurrection scholar. He's a fantastic, so I know him personally, and I can tell you he's a great guy. He's a good professor. He's a godly man. He's a good man. He cares deeply about the gospel. He's evangelistic at heart, and he's an excellent scholar. He works really, really hard. So he wrote a book a number of years ago called Differences in the Gospels, where he's looking at some of the differences in the Gospels, and he's looking at them as a historian, and he's examining not only the history but also some of the literary conventions that would have obtained with the genre of ancient biographies. And he'll do some comparative examples. He'll look at biographies of Cicero, for instance, and he'll look at the tropes that are used there, and he'll look at them in the Gospels. And so he's going to say some things like, for instance, an easy one to point to, and I can almost guarantee, Nathan, you probably talked about this when you were in seminary, but for instance, in Matthew's gospel, the Sermon on the Mount most likely didn't take place on the Mount. It's placed there for symbolic reasons. It's meant to parallel Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the law and the revelation. And then what's happening here, again, through scholarship and examination of some of these literary conventions, what scholars believe is happening here is that Matthew's not being inaccurate. That's a little bit of anachronism to say that he is using this to try to symbolically convey that here we have a new revelation from God. So that kind of thing. I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah. Or he did give it on a mount, and the symbolism is something that we add in later.
Right. So there's a spectrum of responses here.
Because I think my only pause is like, so, and this happens with more Mike Licona stuff. Obviously, the resurrection of the other people around the time of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is like, okay, all that stuff is really neat and interesting to look at. And I'm secretly a closeted, not really huge fan of historical context on a lot of interpretive stuff because I think it gets used in ridiculous ways outside of the actual way in which it's intended to be used. But the tricky thing that it puts us in is that and this might lead into it's like, how do we decide when and where, what is actual historical and what is just symbolic. And then, okay, so that's one whole issue of if we want to go down that rabbit trail. But then it sets up who are the gatekeepers for us to know the true knowledge of what's historical and what's symbolic. And so those are just questions that give us kind of a yellow light, I think, as we proceed forward in life, not in a
Yeah.
fundamentalist sense, but in a way of like, let's just ask some good questions as we go along here, where there's anyway, carry on. I can say more
Right.
about that, but you have more to say too.
Well, and so yes, there is a spectrum there of responses, but one that I want to look at in particular is so Alyssa Childers, whose work, she's a very popular podcast, but she had a gentleman on her show, and they were talking about this, and basically their read on it was that Mike Licona is caving to secularism.
On a
This is
particular interpretive passage or just in his style of work in
in
general?
his scholarly work, that he's caving to secularism. And he's departing from, in this case, so this my example runs the risk of being a bit of a distraction, but because I'm taking it as a kind of case in point of a certain type of attitude. But they believe, as they're speaking, that his work is departing from honoring God's word as authoritative, and that he's walking away from yeah, from an authoritative reading of scripture, that it carries, that it's inspired, basically. So what I want to do here is think about this for a second. So I don't first of all, I don't believe that's what Mike Licona is doing. I think he's using scholarship to examine some of the fine points of what's actually happening. Now there can be some disagreement on some of these issues, but the notion that now this man who has for years been a very faithful defender of the gospel and of Christianity and of the authority of God's word, that now suddenly, because of some of these items that he's bringing up, now he's suddenly out of the fold or caving to secularism or wokeism.
Well,
There's
okay,
a
let
there's
me
a
let me let me play advocate of the advocate here, um,
Yep.
because that is categorically possible for somebody to do. I think
Mhm.
we could go through a list of a name of theologians and scholars who have made that transition and have ended up there. So I'm not saying that Mike Licona is doing that, but I'm also not saying that it's impossible for any Christian, you, me, anybody else, to trend in that direction. So it's knowing that it's categorically possible doesn't make the critique invalid. There's a modern context to this conversation as well.
There is. But nevertheless, this is a hasty conclusion to draw, particularly because Mike Licona has not been on record as defecting or anything like that. He's not abandoned his faith. He's not gone the way of a Bart Ehrman, say. He's simply pressing into some of those details as a historian. And if you press into the details and you go into gospel scholarship, now he's also, what he'll point out here is, and I don't want this to be all about me defending Mike Licona here necessarily. He's not the only one making these kinds of claims, by the way. D.A. Carson says much the same thing on many of these items. So does Craig Keener. Craig Keener has a 2-volume commentary on John's Gospel, and he's kind of a Johannine expert, along with being an expert on all sorts of other
Miracles.
things. He's a rather restless scholar, producing more books than an AI unit could. Just kidding. But so it's the bad faith of this, first of all, and the hasty, I think, a rather reckless throwing around of terms like caving to secularism or hopping on a secular bandwagon. I'm I think I'm seeing in certain sectors of, I'll just pick on my own kind of crew, the evangelical church. I'm seeing more and more of this. Megan Basham's book came out recently, Shepherds for Sale, and it may have had occasional details that are kind of
Yeah,
problematic in some ways.
let me help you here.
I'm
Let me
being a
help
little
you here.
too careful here because,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
go ahead.
So what we're looking for is to loop us back around to you're saying the desire for certainty. And what you see in a lot of the modern conversations and publications is we want to draw the lines and say who's on our side and who isn't. So whether it's shepherds for sale, whether it's the whole conversation around
Mm.
toxic empathy, whether it's which apologist is crossing the line in which categories or whatever, um, it's fine to have those conversations, but we need to ask ourselves what is motivating this. And by and large, there's a time in which we are living in a time in which the polarization of every topic means that anybody who is somewhere close to the center of something is going to get run
Right.
over by people from both directions. And again, that's not to say that people can't step out of or fall out of line of what they've historically confessed or what they're actually part of. That happens. I acknowledge that. But there are also people who walk on the edge of things that make legitimate contributions who are fully on board, but are just asking questions, um, or looking into things. That doesn't mean that they're defecting because they're asking a question that makes people uncomfortable. So it really is, I think, motivated. You know what? Actually, Um, I wrote this in my journal this morning. Is that humility requires such a degree of vulnerability that true humility can only exist where there's deep security.
Hmm.
So if you're really confident of who you are, whose you are, where you come from, where you're going, what your purpose and your mission in life is, that you don't have to you don't worry about the vulnerabilities of like, what will this person think if I say this, or what will this person say if it can give you a, or what if I don't know, um it can kind of give you a humility there. And so I I don't want to juxtapose humility versus certainty here, but I will be happy to put humility versus false certainty or just quick political labels um, in the categories where, and we'll get into this later, I think, because I want to make some statements about, I think there are categories where we can have certainty and there's stuff where we hold it with an open hand and
Sure.
smile about it. But I think, Cameron, really, ultimately, I want to say this is driven by a desire not just for certainty, but certainty on who's on our side and who isn't, and drawing lines in
Mhm.
that way.
Yeah, who's in and who's out. That's a really helpful observation. This is probably a little bit of a roundabout way to do this, but we should bring in some maybe modest definition of fundamentalism because fundamentalism is a very hard word to define. So I think for our purposes, we can't really, I don't know that I can define it so clearly. I think
Well, you
what I
read
can do
Marsden on it, right?
yeah, so drawing from Marsden. So, George Marsden's Fundamentalism and American Culture is a very helpful book. It's been recently updated as well, so that it's remained in print all of these years since it came out, and I believe it came out in the 1980s, may have been the 70s, but it's been updated since then in the 2000s. But it's a very helpful work of history. It doesn't have an axe to grind. Its tone is largely impartial, so far as that's possible. So I would recommend it. It's an interesting book. It gives you will help to give you the history of the modern fundamentalist Christian fundamentalist movement in America. But I think what we can do is talk about a tendency in fundamentalism, which is an aversion to any kind of any ambiguity, sort of a principled opposition to ambiguity. So
Let
that's a
me, let
broader
me,
depth.
let
Yeah.
me,
Go ahead.
okay. Let me be the defender of fundamentalism and its origin for a minute here. So,
Yeah.
I think you have a similar times of cultural upheaval that the fundamentalism as we know today is slightly different from the fundamentalism of the past. In that, back in the early 1900s, there actually was a series of books written called the Fundamentals, which was, I
Mhm.
think, an attempt to really codify a time of American Christian orthodoxy of kind of a broad. I don't know if it would have been had the evangelical label at that point, but to synthesize and put down on paper, here are some of the things that are kind of non-negotiables, or here's an interpretive framework or style that we need sort of as a a beachhead against the liberalization, particularly in responding to some of the German higher criticism, who starts to look at historical context and textual criticism, that kind of thing, and saying, well, maybe the Bible didn't mean this, or we don't really know, or maybe this is just symbolic but not historic. So you have a backlash against that, and then things start to get codified and written down, but which and that's fine. Um, the early church councils did this kind of thing. Like, it happens. Your church probably has a statement of belief. Um, Good enough. What's interesting though is that, like, when you look at the original fundamentals written in the early 1900s, in that series on, like, say, creation, the fundamentals, I'm talking about the books here, mention
Yeah.
4 different ways in which you can interpret Genesis chronologically as far as the timing of creation and still be considered having an high view or an inerrant view of Scripture. So within the early original fundamentals, they would say, maybe God made it instantaneously and called it 6 days. Maybe he did it over time. Maybe he did it in 6 days. When we think of fundamentalism, we don't think of that level of flexibility
No.
at all. So then let's fast forward into like the 40s and 50s, in which some of these become politicized topics. Then you're
Mm.
fighting in schools, school boards about in the legal system
Evolutionary.
about evolution and that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden these things start to get squeezed for political reasons. And so it's not driven by theology. It's driven by politics. And so what I'm not trying to defend or decry anything here other than to recognize that a lot of the things that we now look at as,
Mm,
oh, this is a part of this narrow-minded tradition actually was a political
mm.
response, not a theological conviction. And that's just an important thing to stick a pin in for the moment we
Yeah.
live in now and for the rest of our lives moving forward, is to ask ourselves, why are we getting worked up about this? And what is the true motivation for our concern here? And that, I think, brings me back around to what I was originally saying of this desire for defining, for distinction, for clarifying, that sometimes gets out of hand and pretty judgy.
Yes. I mean, and it's helpful to recount some of that history like you just did. The two major events that inspired the fundamentalist movement were German higher criticism, which you alluded to, and there were all sorts of interesting translation problems happening there. And I'm talking not talking about translations with ancient manuscripts. I'm talking about translations between German and English and the way German scholars were using terms and the way English scholars were using terms. So there was a little bit of a communication breakdown happening there. But that was an alarming trend for many people, and it represented a clear intellectual threat
But I'm saying
to a
that
lot
is
of
the same question we're
Christians.
talking about with Mike Licona right now. There's a group of people saying, look, he's following this historically,
Yes, it
theologically
is.
secular trend. So
It is. Yep.
I'm just saying it's
So
wash,
there's
rinse, repeat. We're doing this again. Here we go.
we're doing that again. So there's that one, and then we're also doing this again. The other one was Charles Darwin's full kind of working out at the time of macroevolution and a full grand story, a different story that displaced humanity from any kind of, basically knocked us off of our special throne.
Ooh, you wanna know where this one's
Before,
going? You wanna
yeah,
know where this one's going? Here's the question. So the whole buzz conversation right now is about whether or not AI can become conscious.
yep,
And if you're taking a evolutionary
yes,
paradigm, you're saying that consciousness naturalistically arises, and therefore, why wouldn't AI be able to generate
mhm,
true consciousness? If you're
sure,
looking at consciousness as something non-natural that is inherently gifted by God to humanity, it doesn't really help us there because we would say, okay, can a consciousness create another consciousness? We see that happen, God to humans. Um, but it also doesn't. There will be
but
questions
provides a
about whether or not it can naturalistically develop its own conscience without another conscience
yeah,
helping it do
it
so. And so I think it won't. I don't think the conversation going forward is going to be about evolution. It's going to be about the development of consciousness. Um,
yeah,
and
it
maybe I'm
provides a
wrong there,
kind
but
of
just let me throw that out there as we go by
model.
here in 2025.
Yeah, no, but I think evolution's not going away either because they're taking more of a there's systems evolution coming forward. But basically, it's being scientists are not sitting idly by with this, so it's not so the theory of evolution looks very different now from Charles Darwin's day because people have been laboring away and working at it as well. And yes, AI is going to present all sorts of the way I've put it, Nathan, this goes along with what you've said is I was having a conversation with recently with a friend of ours, Alicia. Hi, Alicia. And we were talking about what do you think, kind of the question arose, what do you think, what are some of the issues that are going to, really be inspired or provoked by the AI phenomenon? And I said, well, probably image of God is going to be a huge
Hmm.
issue for, I mean, theologians really to work out very carefully and continue to really give a responsible vision for what we mean by being made in the image of God, something that is conferred on us by our Lord.
Okay,
But
so that
but
being
we
said,
digress.
will we not then need to draw some clear lines of saying, "This is what we believe"? I think we will.
Sure.
But that's not being
Well,
but
yeah.
that's not being a fundamentalist. So let's help me work through here, Cameron, how you
No, no, no.
draw clear
Let me
lines
go
of
back.
distinction and belief. I'm not saying this, but just take us all along for the journey.
Yeah, no, no. I'm not opposed to certainty in some categories, but I also think that as human beings, finite, creatures that we are, faith is going to be indispensable. I'm not talking about blind faith. I'm talking about a combination of, knowledge, belief, and trust. And I do think that life is rich and complex, and I do think that we we're going to come up against ideas, paradigm shifting events, and discoveries that will force us to think differently in some instances. Now, in if you have a theological framework in mind, I like you've got orthodoxy, those vital commitments of the faith that have or you could, call it the rule of faith. There are various ways of looking at this, and there are confessional statements that spell this out, of course. Those can structure you well, those can anchor you. But then you also have issues that are in systematic theology that are referred to as adiaphora. There can be some differences on those issues, right? Classic examples in the world of theology are, baptism, approaches to the Lord's Supper, that kind of thing. There's some room there. There is less and less patience with that when you come to moments of cultural upheaval because we want to figure out there's this, like you said, Nathan, this deep desire to say, this person's in, this person's out. Are they
We're
on
looking
our
for
team?
people. Yeah.
Are they not? Yeah. So, yes, there are certain commitments that we can have certainty on in the sense that we have reasonable certainty. I guess let me say something about certainty though here. And it might make some people uncomfortable.
Are you sure?
We can we can have reasonable certainty. Can we have absolute certainty that we're right in every category? No. I don't think that's available to human beings. Not in this so can you know, I mean, part of that has to do with the way we know in the first place. Has to do with categories. I mean, there are certain when we're talking about, water is H2O or this chair is right in front of me. I mean, of course you can ask some of those unpleasant, annoying questions that philosophers do. Yeah, well, what if your brain is somewhere in a vat and there's some evil intelligence just stimulating and simulating all of this? Or what if it's the matrix? What if it's simulation? So there are radical, skeptical examples you can use that can possibly undermine even what you take to be so certain in your immediate sensory experience. But let's set that aside for right now. I think there are certain categories where, yeah, you've got a direct sensory experience, but then you go into the relational category and something like knowing somebody else or even affirming that there is such a thing as other minds. I'm being an annoying philosopher again. This is Alvin Plantinga's example. Well, that's in significant ways an article of faith. Now, you can have reasonable certainty that there are other minds. I'm reasonably certain, Nathan, that you do, in fact, have a very good mind and that you have a consciousness of your own thoughts and your own wishes and intuitions and your own imagination. But I don't know that in the same way that I know that this computer is right here in front of me right now or this microphone. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm just so
Well, so
that total, yeah.
here's what starts to happen is you can spend a lifetime going down this rabbit trail. I always like to jokingly say when Alicia and hi Alicia, spending a lot of time up with student groups at MIT. There was like you had the 19-year-old uh, freshman sophomore at MIT who loved the idea of like wrestling with the idea of whether or not they actually exist. However, by the time you got to the grad students, you run into a 26-year-old who has a wife, two kids, a mortgage, and is finishing a graduate degree. and none of them are sitting around wondering whether or not they exist. Like, life just throws a whole series of experiences at you that you don't have time for the question. And it's not that there's a better philosophical solution to it at, 7 years later in life. It's just that you have to prioritize what it is that you want to focus on. And I
Mhm.
think that is part of like the lupus all the way back to the was it Childers, Mike Licona kind of thing. I'm slightly sympathetic to at a time in which, for me,
Mhm.
does whether or not Jesus was actually on a mountain like Matthew says he was, that's a question that, okay, at one point in time was interesting to me, and I have moved on from decades ago and am now living my life
Yep.
focused on so many other things, um, that I kind of do find myself looping back around to like, you know what? After reading the arguments, the counter arguments, the counter arguments to the counter arguments, and then actually coming back, looping around again to having the epistemic humility to at the end basically say, you know what? I think I'm just going to go with what Matthew wrote here and move on with my life and the 14,000 other questions and problems and issues that I'm working out.
Yep.
And so I don't think that's fundamentalism. It's just a reprioritization of the questions that we have at different times of life. Now, somebody like me might be really helpful for somebody who's going through that for the first phase to walk through the argument, the counter argument, the counter argument to the counter argument to the counter argument. Um, but at some point, you can't live in that. You have to land someplace and go. And so that's, I think, probably some of like I think you and I have both experienced this in our lives that there are some
Mhm.
questions that are just becoming less interesting to us, not because they're not interesting, but just because we have to at some point say, I thought about this for
Yeah.
15 years. I'm sticking with this, and this is how I'm going to orient
Well,
my life. And here we go.
the way I looked at that, this is a separate issue, but it's just kind of a general principle or tip. It depends on you prioritize what gets your attention based on your gifts and your deep passions and the people you're working with. So Mike Licona, it makes sense. His whole area of focus, I mean, and the man is so narrowly focused on is the resurrection and the gospels. And that is pretty much all that gets his attention. So those are the arguments he's involved in, those are the books he's writing,
But
those are
hanging out with
the
the people who
debates
are
he's
asking
doing.
those questions, and most of us aren't.
Absolutely. Yeah, he absolutely, and he's debated Bart Ehrman, I think on several occasions actually, and others as well, Matt Dillahunty, that and so on and so forth. So in other words, it makes sense that this gets this level of attention from him. It's a huge area that he prioritizes. That may not be the case. It's not the case right now for Nathan where he's at in his life. And therefore it makes sense because again, you have finite capacities with attention. But back to the larger issue. So, and by the way, I just have to say this, Mike Licona is not saying in his view, and again, there's a spectrum here, but in his view, none of what he's saying undermines the truth or the veracity of Matthew's gospel. It just means that it's operating with a set of literary conventions that were very typical of its time. But the larger truth that Jesus gave this sermon, that he made these statements, and that he is being set up in this gospel as the Son of God. All of that remains sacrosanct and true. But I just wanted to say that real quickly. But the larger point though that we can't have total and complete certainty on our deeper commitments is common to all human beings. It's not just Christians. You talk to skeptics, and when you speak with an honest skeptic, you very quickly come to the place that, I mean, we talked about this in an earlier podcast, Nathan, but the most responsible intellectual position if you're a skeptic is really agnosticism. Because
Mhm.
any kind of hard atheism is assuming a degree of certainty that seems to be out of keeping with skepticism in the first place. How would you have that kind of knowledge? Even a Richard Dawkins and some of the new atheists are a little bit more chaste on this point now. When they were at the height of their popularity, Nathan, I think given what you said earlier, they were basically a lot of what was behind what they were doing was politics. It wasn't philosophy. Remember, they're and I'm bringing them up here because a lot of people ironically referred to them as fundamentalists. I mean,
Mhm.
and they were basically zealous atheist, evangelistic atheist fundamentalists, But what was it that set them off in the first place? Well, arguably the big event that did it was the 9/11 attacks. And suddenly religion was seen not as a purely private pursuit of suburban moms driving their kids to church, but actually something that had real political force, something that could bring down buildings, something that was a global player, which it's always been, by the way. But suddenly the world was awakened from its collective stupor and people saw that again. And so the charge behind the new atheist tone, that stridency, was a political stridency.
Hmm.
And I think the stridency, the worst instances that we're seeing now infiltrating the church and everybody else, it's a temptation to all of us, have that political edge once again, where you want to trade in humility for a kind of false certainty. And I'm not saying that we can't have reasonable certainty on this. I wouldn't be a Christian if I didn't believe that. I am a Christian because I have reasonable certainty that Jesus is my Lord. I have reasonable certainty about the virgin birth, Jesus's life, death, and
But that's
resurrection, that he
but that
walked on water, all
here
of it.
here Cameron clearly though, he's not saying he has reasonable certainty because he's a Christian. He's saying reasonable certainty is something that we all operate with. I have to have reasonable certainty
Oh,
that I
yeah.
can make it across the road to my mailbox and back before a car comes. Like it's just
Yep. Well, I
that's
think, and
how life
also
works.
the word reasonable is important. Reasonable meaning universal and accessible to all. So not just because I'm a Christian, but if you're a person who's a skeptic or on the fence or you have doubts, I sincerely believe that if you look at the evidence in a responsible manner and look into Christianity in a responsible manner, the reasonable conclusion to draw will be this is true,
Okay,
and I
Cameron,
should follow the need of Christ.
let me, as my concluding, well, it's dangerous to say this is a concluding thought. Let me give a very complicated analogy that I think might help us out here. So when I was a junior in college, I was doing a physics degree. I worked one summer as a laser tracker assistant at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, and we were building replacing the foundation for the world's largest fully steerable telescope. So this is a radio telescope. The dish is 2.3 acres. You could fit a football stadium in this telescope. Um, it weighed like 16.8 million pounds. It rotated on a set of wheels in a circle and tilted both directions. And we had to replace the wear track on this thing, and we had to get it. So it was a circle with a 106-foot radius that had to be level within a 10,000th of an inch. So we're talking about a very large circle that is
Wow.
very, very flat. Yeah. But I mean, if you're pointing at something that's like light years away, if you're off by a little bit, it makes a big difference. So the way that we did this is we had these laser trackers, and each morning we would go in and we had like three fixed points. And I had this little, it was a perfect sphere with an eighth of it cut out so that there was um, it's very hard to for most of you to imagine what a sphere with an eighth cut out of it looks like. But it basically like it's open to the core, and there are three perfectly flat edges that meet in the middle of that sphere, and the laser beam would sit in that little pocket and reflect back to the laser tracker, and I would set it in each of the three uh, core fixed points every morning, and then the laser tracker would find out where it is, and then the rest of the day, I would carry that little ball around, and I had a little thing that I could sit it on, and it would
Mm,
measure its specific location down to incredible precision. Anytime that the beam got broken, I would have to carry the ball back to the origin point, and the laser tracker knew where to swing back and find the reference point, and then we could measure anything anywhere on the whole site and so that's what would happen. I'd work, we'd measure, measure. The beam would get broken. Somebody would walk by. Somebody's hard hat brim would get in it, whatever, and I'd take it back and we'd reset. And so I think in Christianity, what we find is, for me in my study of Scripture and prayer and community with the church, that we get these triangulation points of origin. That we always know where the reference point is. We know where to go and pick the beam back up, and then we don't just sit there on the little pedestal. It gives us the referent for exploring all of the rest of reality. The rest of the site is open and available to us. And there's a ton of stuff that we have to figure out, and things that need to be leveled, and things that need to be measured, and things that need to be discovered and explored. And we're going to mess that up sometime. And the contact beam is going to be broken. And I know where to go back and for the beam to be picked back up on the laser tracker. And then I go at it again. And so having a couple fixed points of reference that we're really certain of, we have a reasonable certainty about, and we know we can go and pick up the, we can we can start it over, we can go pick up the beam again, is invaluable. Where Christians tend to get sideways on this is if somebody starts moving, or it looks like somebody starts monkeying with the orientation point stand. And he's like, no, you're moving the goalpost a little bit. This monkey's with our triangulation points. And so those are the types of things that I think we can. I recognize. I apologize for the complicated analogy. This is just how it works in my mind. Is that there's a phenomenal sense of ways and rooms and places where we don't need to know, we don't have to know, we can have fun not knowing. And then there are a couple core structures where we need to say, okay, this is a true reference point for me in life. And if I move this, it isn't like, oh, that's interesting. We just shift this over. Actually, the rest of the structure doesn't make sense if I move this point. And so those are the, maybe you have some questions about the analogy. I'm trying to come up with one that says, we do have to have a couple places where we say, okay, we're digging in here. This is the reference point. This is what we always come back to. And then if we were to move these markers, it would throw off the rest of the whole structure. Those are the things you need to be worried about moving in your life. But other than that,
Yeah, I like it.
explore.
I don't like the word fundamentals just because of how clouded it's become. There's just there's 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 too much baggage with it now. I prefer the word orthodoxy. Those, yeah, the
But see
orthodox.
orthodoxy as a reference point
Mhm.
and a launch
Yep.
pad, not as a shelter.
Yep.
I think.
Yes. Which,
And
yeah,
I'll,
or an anchor, yeah, that frees you now to explore and meet questions that are challenging without being afraid and threatened. Think again of the person we like to we've referenced recently as John Lennox, who is himself a lifelong learner, committed to exploring, but also deeply committed to theologically conservative Christianity. So, and has not budged on that in all of his explorations because he's properly anchored. And a key part of that, and this is a very on brand thing for us to say at Thinking Out Loud, is going to be your membership in a local congregation of faithful people who will hold you accountable, who will tell you when you're being a knucklehead, and will tell you when you're getting carried away and maybe you're being so open-minded your mind's in danger of falling out. That kind of thing. We all need it. We all need that in different capacities. People who are hardwired like thinkers or intellectuals or academics are sometimes one of the ways in which they get seduced is through ideas,
so
you know?
I'll give a Grandpa Rittenhouse quote to wrap us up here. So
Please.
when I was a younger man, my grandpa and I were walking one time, and he said, Nathan, you by nature like to walk on the edge of ideas and look over the edge. And he's like, and that's great. But he said the safe way to do that for the rest of your life is not to lose that posture, but to make sure you're always holding hands with people who are on firm footing. And I think that's the idea of community here. If you're a little bit curious and you know it, somebody's got to peek over the edge and see what's coming, and be
Mm,
and have that as a. I think it's a God given gift of curiosity, and He delights when we discover things. But it's pretty important that we're holding hands with people who are walking on solid ground as we go along and we peek over those edges. And so I think if you've made it to this part of this conversation, you also are one of those walk on the edge of ideas type of people. And so what Cameron is saying to you there on the importance of community is that analogy of make sure you're embedded among people who love you enough to tell you when you're going astray. And I think in doing so, those won't be conversations of distinction or clarity that happen out of fear or political reasons. It'll just be
yeah.
good brotherly and sisterly love and compassion of journeying well together in life. So um, we didn't make one joke about putting the fun in fundamentalism in this episode, or the mentalism in fundamentalism, but um,
No, we did now.
now we
Yeah.
did. We got it in there. It's obligatory. So there's that. So let's look for the things where we really need to be certain, and then let's be open-handed before the Lord out of a humility that comes from security with the other things. And I think in doing so, God will shape and use and form us into people who really can live productively in the world, but also who have spent time wrestling with questions that other people might want to wrestle with and need to wrestle with. And so, as you're listening to this, it might be a good idea to think back through some of the big questions you've had in life, recognize that you've come through them, and then try to figure out where you can help other people who are stuck in that same question today. just because you're done with a question doesn't mean other people are. And Cameron and I are always trying to work on that ourselves, but let's make that a community effort as we go forward here. Being sure of what we hope for, certain of what we don't see, and leaning with a grin into the future of the unknown of what it is that God is up to in the world and what it is that he would have us do today and tomorrow and the rest of our lives. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.